echo from deep within. A rhythm of solemn and resplendent tunes was reverberating in the music hall. Each note came together to weave an intoxicating symphony of chords that caressed the eardrums as they rose and fell like a gentle ocean wave. Lucien was sitting in the back section of the crowd, his eyes fixated on the conductor standing at the center of the stage, his hand waving fluidly as he guided the music and reshaped it with every flick of the stick. He's probably really good at what he does. Although unfamiliar with the profession, Lucien still arrived at the conclusion. Seated around him were the other guests, each immersed in their own little world as they savored the blissful ecstasy indulging their ears. Lucien retracted his gaze, now piqued by the white sculptures decorating the ceiling. As he studied the exquisite decor, his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He was pondering the effect of music on the human brain and its practical applications. For an after-conference event, it was a surprisingly good place to expand thoughts and brainstorm new ideas. What did I tell you, Lucien? It might not be Bologna, but Catania's concert certainly got her own charms. When the first half was over, the old professor in Lucien's entourage leaned a bit closer. I bet you're glad you didn't go back to the hotel straight away, eh? Professor's curly hair nodded alongside his head. Lucien gave a polite yet distant smile as he watched calmly at the old professor, who was rhythmically waving his hands as he enthusiastically shared his thoughts on the music just played. Lucien could not relate to the professor's passionate emotions. To him, the music, no matter how pleasant it was to the ear, was just an amalgamation of flat and lifeless notes. Still, he found the old professor's enthusiasm amusing. Humans are such fascinating specimens. The human brain is responsible for creating a wealth of intellect and emotions. It creates emotional responses to outside events and induces changes based both on its own judgment and external stimuli. Yet, he felt like an observer, standing just out of reach as he interpreted each discovery as either a perhaps that's what he is in this world, a mere observer exploring the unknown boundaries. What do you think, Lucien? The old professor finally wrapped up his heartfelt speech. Lucien smiled faintly. Yes, it's quite enchanting. Despite being unsatisfied with such short feedback, the professor resentfully returned to his seat since the second half of the concert was about to begin. The members of the orchestra returned to their positions as the conductor walked onto the stage and raised his baton again with a solemn whisk. 50 minutes. Lucien took a glance at his watch before closing his eyes. As the baritone began to sound, the oboes and the clarinets joined suit. The pleasant tunes of cor anglais mixed individually to form a harmonious rhythm, like a lovely maiden curtsying graciously under the fair moonlight. Lucien paused. He slowly opened his eyes in the midst of the captivating notes. An old man played the trumpet, letting out a gentle and ebullient tone as light glistened off its gilded finish. 50 minutes of eternity. Time suddenly seemed to speed up. It was as if 50 minutes had just soared by. Notes seemed to just fly into his ears and caress his senses. Lucien sat quietly as he took it all in. Even as the next song began to play, he still felt entranced as he savored every moment of the bewitching performance. He listened with his ears perked. It was as if something was right before him, but it still eluded his eyes. Before Lucien realized it, the conductor was already bowing toward the audience with the rest of the orchestra. The audience showered them with seemingly never-ending claps of approval. Lucien's gaze steadied before he too joined the crowd in applause. The flow of time was a concept that rarely concerned Lucien. Perhaps it was his busy schedule that always kept his attention elsewhere. After all, he always had so much to do, and each minute was a precious commodity he could ill afford to waste. Looking back at the journey that has led him to where he is today, he never once stopped to contemplate the drips of sand seeping to the other side of the hourglass. It was like he began walking down a winding path, and before he could realize it, he was here where he stood today. That's why he felt there was something special about the 50 minutes bygone. Perhaps it was because the trumpet had given him a momentary reprieve in his perpetual and tireless trek. But it was only for that brief moment. I know a little place where we can grab a bite. What do you say? The old professor extended a warm invitation, the leftover euphoria from the concert still visible across his face. Thank you for inviting me. Lucien let out a polite smile. I still have some unfinished errands to tend to. I think I'll go back and wrap them up. Not knowing whether to feel relieved at Lucien's diligence or dismay at his apparent disinterest in enjoying life, the professor just had a few more small talks before parting ways. Lucien stood for a while longer before moving his feet again. He frowned at the crowd now blocking his exit from the main hall. Looks like there was something else happening after the concert. Lacking any interest, Lucien tried his best to make his way through the crowd. He caught earshot of the words auction and instruments, but none of them was of any discernible concern to him. As he approached the exit, a staff member approached him and eagerly told him that a charity auction was being held for the instruments used in the concert today after half an hour and that they were also hosting a prize draw. The staff member pointed toward a large prize wheel beside him. Lucien took a quick glance and said, "I'm good, thank you." Unabashed by Lucien's refusal, the staff member spun the wheel anyway with a good push. Lucien ended up walking out with a keychain of the concert hall. It was a very well-crafted little piece of art. The decorative glitters dotting the keychain glistened under the streetlight, yet they still seemed dull and colorless in Lucien's eyes. Lucien gazed in the distance and felt the gentle ocean breeze brush up against him. The ancient city stood solemnly against the nightly canvas in the background. The ornate and opulent buildings perfectly reflected the flourishing Baroquism popular at the time. Still, he was never quite a fan of that style of architecture. Perhaps it was time to head back. Lucien put the keychain in his bag but took one step before stopping again. There was a small tremor beneath his feet. It was a moment when he felt his heartbeat become clearly audible. For some unexplainable reason, his thoughts drifted back to the memorable 50 minutes. Or, he could stay a bit longer. Sound of the cosmos. That old trumpet player was probably the last person to put his instrument onto the rack. Lucien stood quietly beside the stained glass window just meters from him. He watched the orchestra members gingerly wipe their instruments before placing them on the display rack, some even bent down. Yet the old trumpet player moved with discernible indifference. He left his old instrument, along with its ragged carrying case, on the rack before being the first person to walk out the door without even a turn of his head. He walked past Lucien. Lucien gave him a quick glance before looking away, his attention drawn toward the rack of instruments as they sat quietly among the lights and guests clamming around them. Lucien was never a collector at heart. Perhaps those instruments would find use in someone else's hands at a distant concert. Or perhaps it might find itself as ornate decor eagerly discussed over a boastful conversation, free from even speckles of dust as it sits quietly sealed in a glass display case. A few younger members of the orchestra were staring at their instruments with a longing expression on their faces. The old trumpet player seemed more at ease. Many buyers were interested in his trumpet. Its mesmerizing sound on the stage has certainly left a memorable impression on those with the fortune to behold its grace. But in Lucien's eyes, it was nothing more than just an ordinary trumpet. He turned around and walked out of the display room, the heavy wooden door slowly creaking shut behind him. The gentle night breeze brushed up against his forehead. Perhaps I really should go back, he thought to himself again. A silhouette not far from him caught his glimpse. It was the old trumpet player from earlier. He wobbled slightly as he walked down the road in a skip. His hands were outstretched like he was holding an invisible trumpet, his fingers dancing gracefully up and down as his head bobbed gently back and forth to the imaginary rhythm. Bemused, children on the road began to follow him in imitation. The night was silent, yet Lucien could swear he heard something. He raised his head as the leaves rustled under the serene moonlight. Gentle ocean breezes brushed up against the small crowd. The children made snorted chuckles as they laughed through the tiny crevices between their fingers. Perhaps it's the sound of the cosmos. Even an ordinary trumpet can hold the secret of the universe. It was as if someone was speaking beside Lucien's ear. He blinked blankly as he looked around. It was as if the world was trembling slightly, yet all he could hear was the silent backdrop. The old trumpet player laughed as he spoke to the kids. This is the loudest voice in the world, yet also the gentlest. It is a blessing from God, my sweet children. Blooming Grey. The conference Lucien was attending ended the following day. However, their flight in the evening was abruptly delayed. Following the old professor outside, Lucien smelled the sulfur and volcanic ash that were already permeating the air, accompanied by a terrifying rumbling in the distance. Sure lives up to its name as one of the most active volcanoes in the world. I heard it's been quite active in recent days. Shame we won't be able to witness its eruption. The old professor pointed toward the volcano in the distance with a clear tone of disappointment in his voice. I was told flights will still be able to take off, albeit slightly delayed. Lucien remained silent as he gazed in the distance. On their way back to the hotel, tourists were eagerly filming the event with an expression of both awe and fear. Old Etna is so active, and it's now a popular tourist attraction, the old professor shrugged as he stared at the distant volcano with unmistakable interest. There was a small crowd gathering in a distant marketplace, seemingly an excellent location to observe the eruption. Many photographers were already set up with their cameras. Children were either hiding behind their parents or sitting safe and secure in the arms of adults. In a bakery not far from the crowd, the delicious aroma of bread can still be smelled despite the overwhelming sulfuric odor. Volcanoes are just one of many ways Mother Nature unleashes her terrifyingly destructive might. Yet human beings, in their unmistakable insignificance, still find ways to find enjoyment in the thrill of danger. Shame indeed, Lucien replied. The old professor was preparing to dig into a serving of freshly baked bread as he nodded. It will be quite an impressive sight if we miss out. But I'm sure there will be more in the future. You're young. You've got a lifetime ahead of you, the old professor chuckled. Just as he finished, a few explosions ruptured in the distance. Something dark and grey flashed through the thick smoke and streaked in front of Lucien's eyes. Almost in an instant, cries for help began to erupt from the crowd. That's not supposed to happen. The old professor gasped. Fire! Children were screaming. The thick ash, accompanied by several explosions, deafened the surroundings. The smell of sulfur was now growing with great intensity. People's eyes were wide open as the sound of shudders rang in the air. Everyone was taken aback by the sudden turn of events. Lucien was standing outside the crowd, trying to piece together his surroundings, but it was as if he missed a piece of the puzzle, so he was unable to make sense of the situation. Monochrome played silently before him. It was as if he were behind an invisible barrier, separated from the profusely erupting gas jettisoning high into the air like an erupting geyser. The screams of people seemed to drag him back to reality. Lucien blinked as his body tensed up. A warning message began flashing ominously on his phone. Mount Etna erupted at 23:16 local time on November 14th. Burn. Things were taking a turn for the worse. What was originally a thrill-seeking crowd suddenly began to panic slightly. Officers soon arrived on the scene to disperse the gathering herd of people. The rumbling continued to bellow in the distance as the crater spewed red-hot lava into the air. A blob of grey was rolling in Lucien's eyes as the thick dark clouds bowled in the backdrop. What a sight! Looks like it's our lucky day. Standing beside Lucien, the old professor spoke in awe. There was an evident trace of fear on his face. Maybe we should put some distance between that and us, eh? He beckoned toward the dispersing crowd and signaled Lucien to follow. Lucien cast one more glance at the erupting volcano. His heart was pounding with not fear but curiosity. What was that light in their eyes? Why did it shine so brightly? His imagination struggled to paint out the whole splendid image. The rushing waves of heat assailed his dulled senses. Despite the force of nature unfolding in front of him, there was something missing from the gushing torrent of grey ooze garnished with scattered and illuminated dots. A dash of colour. Lucien and the old professor walked in the evacuating crowd. Personal belongings were littered around the ground. Mortal possessions seemed painfully insignificant in the face of death. A small speaker was left on the ground, evidently belonging to a tour guide. It was stuck on repeat as it continued to relay information to non-existent tourists. Mount Etna is the most active and iconic volcano in the world with a current height of over 3,200 meters. This Europe's tallest active volcano derives its name from the Greek word atene, roughly translating to I am burning. Lucien's eyes faltered slightly. White streaks were soaring past a blanket of smoke. Not far in the distance, white orbs of light were flowing profusely like a river of dazzling light. Mount Etna is home to some of the most violent eruptions in history. It is estimated that roughly 1 million unfortunate individuals have perished in its wake. Yet, its constant eruption of nutrient-rich volcanic ash has also allowed local agriculture and tourism to flourish. Along with the tide of destruction, it has also sowed the seed of life. The voice on the speaker became muffled and inaudible as they walked further away, but Lucien's eyes were still fixated on the river of pulsing light. Suddenly, he kicked on something solid. He simply stood there in its wake, staring at the trumpet as the rumbling continued in the distance. For a moment, it was as if the trumpet was the one making the deafening noise at him and the world was simply trembling in echoed rumble. Before Lucien realized it, he had picked it up. He stroked it gently with his fingers running across the rusty trumpet covered in thick dust. Perhaps it was dropped here by someone, or perhaps it was waiting here all along. "What are you doing, Lucien?" "Quit standing around," the old professor yelled at Lucien. After a brief pause, Lucien began walking toward the professor once again. "What's this?" The professor frowned at the trumpet. Lucien stared at his hands. The brass casing was chilled to the touch before slowly warming up to Lucien's grip. In the backdrop of the rumbling, Lucien simply said, "I have no idea." Bewildered, the old professor remained quiet, perhaps out of respect. He took out his phone and took a quick glance. "It's already the 15th, but it doesn't look like we'll be flying today. Looks like the earliest flight we can catch is tomorrow morning. You should probably let people know you're gonna be delayed." Lucien raised his head. "It's okay. I'm all good." Standing not far from them were two parents protecting their children among the crowd. The little girl in her father's arms was very young. Her vibrant innocence contrasted vividly with the cataclysm unfolding in the distance. She grabbed onto her father's collar and excitedly pointed toward the volcano in the distance. "Look, Daddy. Such a big candle." A normal day. "We will be landing at Loveland City Airport in half an hour. The local time is 3:08 a.m., November 16th. The local temperature is 14 degrees Celsius." Lucien slowly opened his eyes. There was now a glimmer of light in the otherwise pitch-black backdrop. It looked stunningly like the volcano in Lucien's mind. As the plane landed, an instrument case was now with Lucien's luggage. To this day, he still has no idea why he decided to bring it back with him. Perhaps it was simply a special souvenir, he thought. After sending the old professor away, Lucien hopped on the next taxi. It was already 5 a.m. when he arrived back at his apartment. The night was still deep as the moonlight shone a welcoming light to take him home. Lucien placed the instrument case on his desk. With a crisp click, it flung open. The moon shed its light onto its rusty shell. Lucien gently knocked on its casing with his knuckle and was rewarded with a dull echo. To him, it felt like nothing but an ordinary trumpet. He closed its lid and opened the door to the storage room. There was another similar case stashed high on the top shelf. Lucien did not raise his head. He gave the bottom of the space a quick clean and hastily placed the case inside before closing the door. A few email notifications began popping up on his phone. Lucien returned to his desk and opened his emails. He had missed quite a few documents, thanks to the time difference. He opened the experiment logs individually before carefully examining and marking issues in the procedure. Those days that passed on were just ordinary days, nothing but a slightly regretful chunk of wasted time. Lost in thought, Lucien clicked open another document. The horizon in the distance was already slowly lighting up. The once deserted street was once again becoming somewhat lively with the chatter of children walking toward the school. Lucien looked outside the window. It was going to be a cloudy day. The thick clouds congregated in the distance, much like the ashes of Mount Etna. Lucien opened another experiment log and put on his work glasses. The room was quiet other than the rhythm of sporadic mouse clicks that seemed to go on forever. Suddenly, a notification popped up on his phone. A sharp S was clearly visible on the screen. It was an invitation to next week's meeting. Lucien retracted his gaze and returned to his normal, uneventful day.